Then presently, be sure to see our art exhibit. It's Ron L. Clark. And the next one is coming July 1st, and it will be here till August 26th. That's the Nautica, which will be local artists. And the reception for that will be July 12th. Then, of course, the biggie of the year, plan on, is the Chowder Fest, July 22nd. And just to give you a little heads up, the pre-tickets, if you get them ahead of time, are $25, and then if you wait and get them at the door, you have to pay $30. So if you're going to go, good idea to get them ahead of time. Now this evening, I'm very happy to welcome back two people who are associated with our museum and have been here before, Jim Kosinski and Jerry Leckie. They are both wonderful docents, volunteers, and historians. And they are going to talk, and I'm curious about this title, Wooden Walls, Building the Navy That United America. And they tell me that their talk will be about the unexpected and transformative effect that building and launching the first ships of the U.S. Navy had on our country, its spirit, its politics, and its economy. Jim says that reading the story of John Paul Jones' sea victory aboard the, this is where I have a toughie, Bonhomme Richard. That was the ship. I always wanted to say Bonhomme. During the Revolutionary War, captured his 7th grade imagination, and as an adult he joined the Navy, and by amazing coincidence served aboard the 2nd U.S. ship, the Bonhomme Richard. Today, this lifelong reader of naval history enjoys sharing that knowledge here at the museum. Jerry, his partner, that is going to be presented tonight, confesses that he had a case of history phobia as a child. But fortunately, he matured. He learned that history is important to our lives and daily decisions we make about them. Today, he enjoys performing historical research and, like Jim, sharing that knowledge with visitors to our museum. So, I am going to turn you over now to our two favorite people here at the museum.
Can you hear us okay?
Testing 1, 2, 3.
Good.
This is the voice of God.
When Jerry and I first spoke here at the museum, we told you about the beginnings of the U.S. Navy. But what we didn't tell you were the many obstacles faced in actually getting the ships in the water. So tonight we'll complete the story, and we'll take you into the swamps and behind the political scenes and the intense rivalries to tell you of the 6 frigates that helped unite America and launch what is today the world's largest navy. Now, to remove any confusion, it's important that we distinguish here between our Revolutionary War's Continental Navy and the United States Navy, which came along 9 years later. Now you might ask what navy was in between. We didn't have one for political reasons. More about that later. So let's step back. It's 1790. Our war of revolution is over. Our Continental Navy has been disbanded for lack of funding. All the warships have been sold off. Our country is facing an economic crisis because of the war debt. It's really on the ropes. Now, to get the economy moving again, our merchants need to increase their trade with Europe. However, the rulers along the North African coast, the Barbary states, are making things very, very difficult. Now, every time one of our ships passes through the Straits of Gibraltar or sails around this area here, these North African rulers send out their corsairs to seize the ship, seize the cargo, hold the crew for ransom, or worse yet, sell them into slavery. Insurance rates are spiking. Sailors don't want to work on ships sailing into these dangerous waters. President Washington embraced a policy of strict neutrality because we no longer had the protections of the Royal Navy. And we began paying tribute to these North African pirates, but it never seemed to be enough. They kept upping the ante. Well, by now, there were many in Congress saying we need a navy of our own to protect our merchant fleet. But as you'll soon learn, not everyone was supportive.
Indeed. Fast forward to 1794. By that year, the clamor for the federal government to do something about the Barbary pirates was deafening. So in response to public pressure, Congress passed a resolution to create a navy. Now, they figured that the greatest danger to America's merchant fleet were the small vessels of the Barbary pirates. So they appropriated funds to acquire a squadron of 6 frigates. And we'll get to the ships shortly. But first, indulge me and allow me to talk about the politics that led up to this decision. In the 1790s, there were no official political parties in the federal government, but members of Congress did tend to group themselves together philosophically. And I won't belabor the point tonight, but man, congressional debates over whether to create this Navy and acquire these 6 ships exposed some fundamental differences. There were 2 main groups in opposition here. One called themselves the Federalists, and the other group called themselves the Democratic Republicans. Now, the Republicans said, you just can't, the U.S. can't afford a Navy because of our Revolutionary War debt. But they had another agenda. They were utterly obsessed with the idea of restricting the size of the federal government. And Jim will explain the reasoning for that obsession later on. The Federalists, on the other hand, argued the long-term benefit to the U.S. economy of protecting our merchant fleet. And they crowned their argument with a rousing appeal to national honor. This was something new. In 1794, America was a brand new country, made up of a loose collection of formerly independent colonies, each concerned with its own problems. So getting a consensus in anything through the federal government was very, very difficult. And people still thought of themselves as citizens of the state in which they lived. That they were Americans was kind of an afterthought floating down from the ether someplace. Well, you'll be overjoyed to know that the Federalist argument won out. President Washington signed the Naval Act into law on March the 27th, 1794. Now, the act authorized the War Department to either buy or build 6 frigates. A frigate was a medium-sized warship that the government thought could handle the pirates. And the decision to build the ships rather than buy them was quickly made for quality control purposes. Now, the overall responsibility for this project fell to Secretary of War Henry Knox. Now, Knox had never been to sea, He didn't know anything about ships, much less warships. But he was a practical man to a point. And Philadelphia was not only the national capital, it was also the largest shipbuilding center in the country. So he decided to seek out local authorities on warships. Think about it. That wasn't easy to do in Philadelphia because almost to a man the major shipbuilders were Quakers, and their faith would not allow them to build warships. But Henry Knox was persistent, and he found out that a small group of that faith had actually fought during the Revolutionary War. And one of those renegade Quakers was a well-respected shipbuilder in Philadelphia called Joshua Humphreys. Knox interviewed him, and Humphreys agreed to begin drafting a design proposal for the ships. And let's just say that his proposal dazzled Henry Knox.
Yes, it did. Humphrey's idea was innovative, and a revolution in the building of warships. And this kind of creative thinking may have been just what the Secretary of War was looking for. Now, Humphreys, it seems, came along at the right time in our history. He was intelligent, methodical, self-assured. He apprenticed at 14. By 21, was making a name for himself in the shipbuilding industry, and this was even before the Revolutionary War. So by 1786, his yard was one of the most successful in Philadelphia. Now, the professional shipwright of this period was conservative by tradition. His craft was an heirloom, handed down, generation to generation. It evolved slowly, one step at a time. A ship launched in 1794 was not much different from one built 50 years earlier. So while Humphrey's idea may have dazzled Henry Knox, it did not impress these pillars of the shipbuilding industry, not at all. To them, Humphrey's idea was unorthodox. It was unconventional. It was experimental. And therefore it was controversial. Humphrey's architecture called for frigates that would be up to a third larger than anything the French or the English had in that size of warship. They carried more big guns on one deck than rivals would have on two and fire a devastating broadside, yet be fast enough to outsail any larger adversaries. Probably pirates would be no match. And in private, Humphrey said neither would the French or the English. He planned to use a layered hull, like you see here, to give his ships almost cannon-proof strength, along with diagonal supports, risers they were called, to prevent bowing or hogging, a common problem with big ships. Now Humphreys,
Jim, I think we've convinced them that Humphreys was a pretty smart guy, but not everybody agreed with that. We've got to tell them about Jonathan Penrose. Jonathan Penrose was a major shipbuilder in Philadelphia. He was a Quaker, and he was a business rival of Joshua Humphreys. And no doubt, he had heard about the enormous amount of federal funds being earmarked for these 6 ships. So he scheduled some meetings with Henry Knox, during which he proposed that he had discovered serious design flaws in Joshua Humphreys' design. The frames were too heavy, the ships were too large, the long keel would cause instability, and so forth and so on. And another major shipbuilder, Josiah Fox, agreed with him, and between them they said, frigates of this size are not built anywhere in the world, and that must be for a good reason. Furthermore, if the British and the French are not building frigates of this size, why should the United States? Why not rely on the wisdom only from centuries of experience. And so forth and so on. Poor old Henry Knox must have felt like he was being pulled apart at the seams. He didn't know who to believe. So he invited more shipbuilders in and tried to get them to reach a consensus. Didn't happen. So he did get Josiah Fox involved in the project. And how did that work out?
Well, in the end, Josiah Fox and Joshua Humphreys, they agreed on a design. They altered the stern a little bit, but they left the rest of Humphreys' architecture intact, just as he designed it, including the size of the ships. Humphreys was awarded the title of ship's constructor, but Josiah Fox had been trained in the Royal Navy shipyards as his subordinate. This did not sit well at all. Nonetheless, Henry Knox, Secretary of War, must have been very pleased that these two had come to an agreement. Though as history points out, it was a very uneasy truce. Well, Henry Knox took the plans to President Washington. He studied them, signed off on them, and he ordered that construction of these 6 frigates begin as soon as possible. To spread the financial benefits around and to ensure that a handful of Philadelphia Quakers wouldn't be our nation's only source of expertise when it came to building warships, the president ordered that each frigate was to be built in a different seaport. Boston, New York, Philadelphia, Baltimore, Portsmouth, and Dover. Now, shipbuilding at this time was the most costly, labor-intensive industry in the world. Congress had allocated $685,000 to build these 6 frigates. Well over $15 million in today's money, and a staggering amount for our nation of only 4 million people. Benjamin Franklin, watching these heated debates in Congress, wrote, "Necessity never made for a good bargain."
Let's pause for a minute and consider who would be sailing these new ships. And let's look at the issue from the perspective of President Washington. He had personally observed the inept crews of the Continental Navy during the Revolutionary War. So he was absolutely determined that this new Navy would employ only the best. For example, John Barry, the first captain chosen. Barry was a resident of Philadelphia. His ship was being built there. He had the advantage of working side by side with Joshua Humphreys, but he also had the ear of President Washington, who relied on his advice for choosing the other 5 captains. And fortunately for the U.S. Navy, one of that number was Thomas Truxtun. Truxtun would do more to form the culture of the Navy officer corps than any of the other captains. In a manner of speaking, he wrote the book on U.S. Navy training and discipline. And fortunately, his views percolated throughout the officer corps. But let's go on and talk about the construction of these ships now. President Washington was in no mood to economize. And he was adamant that these 6 vessels would be built only with the best materials. And North America was endowed with all of the raw materials necessary for shipbuilding. White oak for planking, pine for masts, hemp for cordage, flax for sailcloth. And for the key pieces of the ship's framing, southern live oak. A southern live oak tree, a mature tree, can shoot up to 70 feet high. Its branches can spread out to 150 feet or more. But the point is, the tensile strength of its wood and its resistance to rot made it ideal for the load-bearing sections of a sailing ship's frame. And Joshua Humphreys was absolutely certain that southern live oak would be necessary for his oversized frigates. And therein lies a story. This tree is found only in the southeastern United States, in a coastal zone stretching from Virginia to Texas. And that looks like a vast territory. We'll remember two things. Number one, it took 1,000 of these trees, over 1,000 of these trees to build each ship. And number two, in the 1790s, the only part of this territory that the U.S. controlled was from Virginia down to Georgia. And in that little coastal zone, most of the forests have been cleared for farming. What to do? Well, that left the only really plentiful supply of southern live oak available to the United States on the swampy, miserable, insect-infested islands off the coast of Georgia.
Knowing what we know now, it's surprising the ships got built. You recall President Washington ordered construction to begin as quickly as possible, so the logistics of getting everything together under short notice was a very formidable task. Along with all the political obstacles Jerry mentioned, there was a lot of opposition from the northern timber interests. And already, Joshua Humphreys had to go ask Congress for another $450,000. So there were cost overruns. This was proving to be far more difficult, expensive, and time-consuming than anyone had imagined. Now you recall, the Naval Act was signed in March. So by June, workmen were on the site down here on the islands down in Georgia, ready to harvest the wood. It was a wet year. The workmen set up camp at the edge of a swamp, where along with the never-ending rain, they were tormented by all kinds of insects, including ticks and mosquitoes, not to mention snakes and alligators. June, July, and August proved deadly for both man and beast. Diseases like cholera and yellow fever and malaria ravaged the workers. Oxen became mired and collapsed. The first shipments of wood were expected to arrive in the shipyards sometime in August, and when it didn't show up, Captain Berry was sent down from Philadelphia to find out what's taking so long. He found only 6 of the original 67 workmen remained, and cutting had come to a halt. So it was decided to wait for cooler weather. So the following month, more workmen arrived. This was in September. And this time, they had with them the dimensions for the different parts of the ship, like the frames, the knights' heads, and the knees, and so forth like that. But for Joshua Humphreys, his work had started in Philadelphia months earlier, and it began with a set of dimensional measurements. And then using these measurements, he drew out on the floor the large diagrams of the ships. Now this process is called lofting, and it's critical because it's in the lofting process that the molds are made. And I'm told that it's very confusing when you have 3 views of the ship layered on top of one another. Now the frame pieces had to be cut from the oldest and the largest of the live oak trees. And as luck would have it, those trees were in the most remote and most inaccessible parts of the swamp. It required teams of oxen to pull them out of the swamp and the tangled underbrush. Well, a month after Captain Berry arrived down there, work was still going slow. Men were getting sick, they were quitting. And that was when Captain Berry decided that most northern men are just not cut out to work in that southern climate. So he contracted with a local plantation owner to use his slaves, and I'm sure you'll see the irony in this. It was the slaves who cut much of the wood. they built the rowers. And they hewed the wood into the proper pieces, and they cut it into manageable sizes so it could be shipped to the yards. Well, the following year, March and April, the wood began to arrive in the different seaports, and very slowly, construction of the frigates began. And while each ship was built in a different shipyard, all of the molds and the designs came from Humphreys in Philadelphia. And this represented a major advancement in ship construction. 6 complete sets of molds were made and were shipped out. This had never been done before. And we have to wonder if Henry Ford wasn't inspired by this assembly line approach.
While Jim's catching his breath, let me set a scene for you, because it's important. The ship that would be known as USS United States was being built in Philadelphia, and she was almost complete. And of all the hulls being created on the banks of the Delaware River, the superstructure of United States overshadowed all the others. And she was a beehive of activity. Workers were caulking her hull. Others were inside of her installing bulkheads and interior decks. So it's not surprising then that all of this frenetic activity piqued the curiosity of the citizens of Philadelphia.
The visitors to the ship there in Philadelphia included President Washington and his cabinet. But there were other visitors to the ship who were adamantly opposed to the building of these 6 frigates. Those in this camp sided with the anti-federalists, or what were known as the Democratic Republicans. And there were some of the most respected names in American history. James Monroe, Thomas Jefferson, Richard Henry Lee, Patrick Henry, give me liberty, give me death. Those of this political philosophy, having fought through our Revolutionary War, had seen firsthand how oppressive a strong military can be. And they did not want our new nation following the European military kind of model. And so, yes, they were very much opposed to it. And this political divide, they didn't want a military any larger than a local militia or small gunboats for harbor protection. And that political divide became very apparent when Benjamin Franklin Boschee, the grandson of Ben Franklin, visited the ship one day. And he got into a fight with one of Joshua Humphrey's sons. Now Boschee, who had taken over his grandfather's printing business, was known as Lightning Rod Jr. Because unlike his grandfather, who supported a national military, Boschee was adamantly opposed to it. And he wrote scathing articles against Federalist policies. Well, in spite of the opposition, USS United States, the first of America's 6 frigates, was finally launched in May 1797, some 3 years after the signing of the Naval Act.
Let's step back a notch for just a second. During construction, the 6 ships were only designated as frigates A through F. But as completion, Secretary Knox delivered a list of suggestions to President Washington and asked him to name the ships. And he did, in the most unique way. He named 5 of the ships for principles embodied in the U.S. Constitution. United States, President, Congress, Constitution, and Constellation. The 6th they named Chesapeake, probably for the bay of which it was built. Now, all 6 of the ships were launched by 1800, and they immediately proved themselves. First, in the Quasi-War with France, then in the Barbary Wars, and they became a force to be reckoned with in the War of 1812. Cemented an incredible emotional bond between the citizens of this country and the Navy. Naval officers became as popular as movie stars are today. Cities, counties, and streets and schools were named for them. They even appeared on postage stamps. So with this emotional bond, Americans finally became to consider themselves citizens of a single nation. And in that respect, America's wooden walls and the Navy that it represented truly brought the United States together. Now, let's take a closer look at one of those wooden walls, USS Constitution. Not only is she still afloat, she's still in commission.
Old Ironsides is probably the most researched vessel we have. She has quite a storied history. For those who don't know how she got her name, it was during the War of 1812 when Constitution fought HMS Guerriere up around the mouth of the St. Lawrence River. A sailor aboard either the Guerriere or the Constitution, and I've heard it either way, anyhow, a sailor saw some of the cannonballs from the Guerriere bouncing on the Constitution, and someone shouted, "She's made of iron!" Well, of course, the Constitution's not made of iron. She was made of solid American life. But this is how she earned her name. Well, some of you may have read about her successful battles, and maybe even about that daring escape from the British off the coast of New Jersey using her kedge hangers. But less is known about what became of the Constitution following the War of 1812. Well, after the war, she was put in the shipyard for repair. And then she was put in, laid up in ordinary for a number of years, or what the Navy now calls mothballs. She did a couple tours of duty in the Mediterranean, came back and was put back in mothballs. In 1830, a newspaper article claimed that Navy was going to scrap the Constitution because by now she was in such bad shape. And this is what led Oliver Wendell Holmes to write his famous poem. And this generated a lot of support. There were fundraising efforts, and school children sent in their pennies to preserve the Constitution. And the Navy responded by putting the Constitution back in the shipyard and repairing her, and then placing her back in commission. The Navy said they never planned to scrap the Constitution, by the way. For a couple of years, she served as the flagship of the Pacific Squadron. This was at a time when we did not have naval bases out here, so the Constitution and the other ships used harbors out of South America. I read the sailors didn't mind that. She, in 1844, she did a 2-year around-the-world cruise, the first U.S. warship to do so, sailing 54,000 miles. It was around this time that the Constitution captured a slaving ship operating off the coast of Angola, Africa. And this would prove to be her final military action. She was brought back home, decommissioned, and laid up in mothballs. Here's a picture of her about 1880, serving as a receiving ship in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, with a roof no less, making her look more like an apartment house than a proper warship. Fast forward about 50 years, 1931 to 1934, the Constitution is back in commission, and she's making a 3-coast goodwill tour. Here you see her transiting the Panama Canal. And another shot of her up in Seattle, or maybe that's San Francisco. In 1940, Old Ironsides was named the official flagship of the U.S. Navy. During World War II, she served as quarters for naval officers awaiting court-martial with a roof again. Old Ironsides is one of our most treasured artifacts. Thousands visit her each year in Boston. And as Jerry said, she remains in commission today. This is why we don't have an aircraft carrier or something in the Constitution. To ensure that there will always be a ready supply of wood for her maintenance, Old Ironsides has her own forest. It's called Constitution Grove in Crane Forest, Indiana.
You might ask, what happened to Constitution's sister ships? Well, we lost two during the British blockade of the Atlantic coast during the War of 1812. Now, both losses are historically memorable, but for different reasons, and I'll explain. USS Chesapeake just was badly beaten in a firefight in 1813. All of her officers were killed. And Captain James Lawrence's dying words eventually became the motto of the U.S. Navy. They were, "Don't give up the ship." The British towed her back to their base in Halifax, Nova Scotia, and they buried Captain Lawrence with full military honors. They repaired Chesapeake and absorbed her into the Royal Navy as HMS Chesapeake, and she served until 1819. Now, USS President was captured by the British a couple of years later when she tried to sneak out of New York Harbor and run the blockade. Now, neither the Royal Navy nor the U.S. Navy knew this at the time, but this entire event took place after the peace treaty had been signed, ending the War of 1812. Nevertheless, the President was absorbed into the Royal Navy as HMS President and served until 1818. Now, the other three ships served the U.S. for many years. Congress until 1834, Constellation until 1853, and United States served 68 years until 1865. Now, during their years of active duty, these 6 remarkable ships fought in 3 wars, combated piracy, performed diplomatic missions, and protected America's maritime interests worldwide.
From 1797 until 1815, these were the largest, the fastest, and most powerful ships in the Navy. And even after new classes of warships were introduced into the fleet, these old frigates, designed by Joshua Humphreys, were considered a choice assignment. In looking for a way to close out our talk tonight, I happened across a piece that was written by a naval officer some years ago. When describing these 6 frigates, he said they were to our Navy what the early efforts of artists sometimes are. Efforts which they look back to with surprise, but cannot reach again. Their model cannot be surpassed. And so with that, we will close our talk.
The Constitution is the only commissioned ship in the U.S. Navy that's currently commissioned that has won a battle against another warship.
That's right. That's right.
And Chesapeake, that lost the firefight, was the only one of the 6 who ever lost a firefight. And there was a good reason for that. And if that piques your interest, doing a little research to find out why she lost the firefight would be an interesting thing for you to do.
Oh. I thought I saw the Constellation involved. Was it?
No. The Constitution is the only one of the 6 that's still afloat.
Constellation.
You did see the constellation, but it's not the original constellation. Incidentally, today is the 50th anniversary of the first submarine to circumnavigate the globe underwater.
And his name was?
The USS Triton. Captain didn't know where he was going. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for coming.